Ladies and gentlemen, in 2004, the Council's landmark Innovative America report identified the key pillars of competitiveness: talent, technology, investment, and infrastructure. This afternoon, we take a fresh look at these pillars in 4 moderated TED-style conversations that will draw attention to key policy recommendations for lawmakers at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. Joining us are Ms. Adena T. Friedman, President, the NASDAQ OMX Group; the Honorable Catherine A. Novelli, Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy and the Environment, U.S. Department of State; Dr. Randy Woodson, Chancellor, North Carolina State University; and Mr. Paul Yarossi, President, HNTB Holdings Limited.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adena Friedman. I'm the president of NASDAQ, and I'm starting with a discussion of investment as a key pillar of competitiveness today. So if we look at what funds investments around the world, and certainly in the United States, I would actually start with government investment. The federal government has an important historical role in providing investment that drives national competitiveness. President Lincoln spearheaded critical investments such as the Transcontinental Railroad, the Morrill Act to create land grants for colleges, and the building of canals, through much of which has gone through, most of the imports going through the United States. And it is questionable whether those types of investments could actually be made in today's political environment, but they sure were landmark investments that the country made to grow the country to what it is today. The United States today accounts for 1/3 of all global R&D, with the federal government leading the way in funding basic long-term research. The limits of government investment, however, have been debated since the founding of the nation. $16 trillion in national debt and $1 trillion in annual deficits have increased the pressure on government investment. And therefore, we have to look at private investment as a critical element of building competitiveness in the United States today. So if we turn to private sector investment, the markets have continuously evolved over the last 50 years to create robust, deep, and liquid markets supporting debt, private equity, and public equity investment. And I'm going to spend my time primarily on the equity side, seeing that I come from NASDAQ, but I will touch quickly on the debt side. Of course, the debt rates are at the cheapest potentially ever in our history in terms of a sustained, long, cheap debt markets. The issuance of debt has been historically high, both in public debt and private debt. The bond rates are at amazing lows, and you can look at terming out your debt over a long period of time, providing a very stable amount of debt capital on your balance sheet, and to be able to make sure that you have a stable balance sheet that allows you to then focus your cash flow and other things on investments in your future. So I do think that the debt markets are a critical component of the healthy investments that you're seeing in the United States today. However, when we really look at what really fuels growth in the United States, job creation in the United States, I'm actually going to start with venture capital. Venture capital is a catalyst for job creation, innovation, technology advancement, international competitiveness, and increased tax revenues for the United States. So it's really a foundational element of our markets and what drives U.S. competitiveness. According to the National Venture Capital Association, 11% of private sector jobs come from venture-backed companies, and venture-backed revenue accounts for 21% of U.S. GDP. In 2013 alone, VCs invested almost $50 billion of capital in over 6,000 deals. And so therefore, if you look at these, that's a huge amount of investment dollars being put to work at small and really, really small companies to get them started, to get them going, to get them raising or bringing in jobs and creating ideas, turning ideas into reality. So in 2013 also, we had 225 venture capital funds close almost $30 billion. So you also have new money flowing in as people look at the return potential of the venture business. Now, while venture returns, frankly, have been challenged over the years, I would say that the strong firms have definitely been able to generate outsized returns for their investors while also fueling the growth for those small companies to move on and grow into mature companies, whether private or public. So now we turn into looking at the more mature companies. How do they continue to grow and find capital to fuel innovation and growth within their organizations? And I'm going to actually turn to private equity. I actually spent the last 3 years at Carlyle before returning to NASDAQ, and I can tell you that private equity really is an amazing source of capital for a lot of companies, both actually worldwide. So I think that if we look at the fundraising in private equity, in 2013, it's really returned with a fury, frankly, with 902 private equity firms attracting almost $500 billion into their funds, which is a 21% increase over 2012. And then if you look at the returns that the private equity funds are generating, buyout funds generated a 16% return last year and continue over a 5, 10, 20-year period to generate outsized returns for investors. So it really has proven itself to be a resilient and very important element of our economy. If we also look at how many deals were done, buyout deals, deal making in 2013 was up 22% over 2012 in terms of the value of the deals that they did. So we continue to see new investments going into taking companies private or putting private investment into companies that are as they grow and expand their business. In terms of where they're putting their money to work, the United States continues to be the most important and biggest market in which private equity are making investments today. Brazil, China, and other emerging markets have grown substantially over time, but the return environment there is kind of dampened a bit over the last few years. So you are seeing more deals being done in the United States today. And then when you look at what is it that private equity, why am I at NASDAQ really talking about private equity as being such an important part of our economy, is because frankly, I look at private equity as a moment in time for a lot of companies. They've gone out of venture, they get more investment dollars through private equity, but eventually the private equity firms are looking for a cash return on their investment. And they'll either go to the public markets or potential to M&A. But if we look at turning to the public markets, the exit activity in 2013 was up substantially 9% by the number of exits and significantly in terms of the value of the exits. And the number of buyout IPOs in 2013 was 187 compared to 112 the prior year. So they are absolutely using the public markets as a key exit vehicle for them to generate returns for their LPs or their investors, and that then gives an opportunity for public investors to get invested in these companies and continue to see them grow and generate returns in the public markets. So it is definitely a critical part of our economy, and I believe that it really is what makes us competitive. If you look at the top 5 or even the top 10 private equity firms in the world, they're all US-based firms. Now, they're putting money to work everywhere. They're getting money from LPs all over the world. But at the end of the day, the level of competitiveness and the level of strength in that market really emanates from the United States. So now we turn to the U.S. public markets. And of course, I think that the key for America is to provide access to capital that can fuel worthwhile investments in innovation and infrastructure. And of course, the public markets have always been one of the key elements of and foundations of our economy and our competitiveness. Interestingly, worldwide exchanges have grown substantially. Liquidity has grown substantially all over the world. NASDAQ, in fact, is a software provider to over 80 exchanges around the world. You may not have known there were 80 exchanges, but that's not even all of them. And so that is very much a big part of fueling economic growth around the world, is building efficient and deep capital markets everywhere. However, when we look at the United States, the public markets still in the United States are about $15 trillion of value in the United States versus $50 billion approximately worldwide. So we are still a huge part of the market and part of the overall economy worldwide, but recognize that other markets are certainly growing in strength and importance. In 2012 to 13, so over that period of time, there was about $99 billion raised in the public markets. Over 400 IPOs. And in 2014 year to date already, there's been $43 billion raised this year so far across 215 IPOs. So it's a very robust market right now. It's very open and available. It's a great way for companies to find new levels of currency and to be able to take their companies, grow them further, and continue to innovate. However, there is one new thing that's happening with the Jobs Act. So the Jobs Act came into place and allowed a few things, actually, that I think are very healthy for the U.S. economy and competitiveness. Number one, it allowed for companies that have less than $1 billion in revenue to file confidential filings with the SEC. So they don't actually have to tell the world everything about themselves until the moment they're about to go public, until they've made that final decision to go public. That creates them a safer environment for them to go out and make sure that the SEC is ready for them to be a public company. The second thing is these same companies are allowed to what they call test the waters. So they can go out and talk to buy-side firms, understand whether or not there's real demand for their company and whether or not there's a healthy market environment for them to go public. And that also gives them a safer way for them to make sure that when they do they pull the trigger and make the decision, they can feel confident in the reception in the marketplace. But the last thing that's very interesting is that the number of shareholders required for a company to start filing with the SEC went from 500 to 2,000. So what does that actually do for companies? It actually makes them want to stay private longer. So at the same time, they want to seek liquidity, they want to raise capital, they want to be vibrant, they want to innovate. And what's great about the United States is that we're able to find ways to allow them to do that in a private company setting. So one of the initiatives that NASDAQ has is the creation of something called NASDAQ Private Market that allows companies in a private setting to raise money or to seek liquidity for their current shareholders. And it allows them to do that in a private transfer and from one party to another, or to look out and seek buyers in a private company context. We believe that that's an important element of maintaining competitiveness worldwide and making it so we continue to offer choice to companies as they look to make investments and raise capital. So we're very pleased to be a part of that evolution of the markets, and we believe that it will become an increasingly important part of the capital market regime here going forward. In summary, I think that the United States is uniquely positioned to be incredibly competitive long-term in the world economy when it comes to investment. We have the majority of investment dollars are going into U.S. funds and are being invested by U.S. funds, whether they're public funds or private funds. We have the deepest, most liquid markets in the world. We have the most variety of ways for people to raise capital, and we believe that the U.S. government also provides a lot of choice and is pretty creative and flexible in allowing that to happen. So we are very, very pleased with the position that the U.S. is in. We also see ourselves in a global economy. So I'm going to turn it over now to the next panelist who will talk about globalization and competitiveness. Thanks.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Catherine Novelli, the Undersecretary of State, and I'd like to focus my remarks on three key policy areas that the State Department and the U.S. government is pursuing to support America's global competitiveness and technological innovation. The first one is trade policy, and trade is a critical component of our competitiveness. And what's important is that we have a level playing field so that our goods can compete in services. And we don't believe just that American companies are highly competitive and will benefit from export opportunities. We also push to open markets for goods and services and ideas because we believe that that is a critical enabler of technological advancement and innovation in the U.S. economy. Second, we work very hard around the world to maintain an open and free internet. And despite the compelling economic benefits of an open internet, various groups and countries are pushing for a system of internet governance that could control and limit how people and companies connect with one another. And I spend a great deal of my own time marshaling the U.S. government resources to counter this impulse and educate the global public about the benefits of the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance, which includes businesses, which includes NGOs, includes governments, but it isn't exclusive to governments. Third, the State Department is actually a significant promoter of science and technology cooperation through a web of agreements that we have with other countries, collaborative efforts, exchange programs. And this is an area where countries are very eager to cooperate with us. We are fostering these relationships among governments, industries, universities, and they all play a critically important part in our national competitiveness. 95% of the world's consumers and 80% of the world's purchasing power lies outside of the United States. And so that's why we have to focus on trade and investment. At the same time, 98% of US firms are small businesses, but only 1% of those are exporting. Exporting can create huge competitive benefits for companies, as you all know, by creating economies of scale, spreading market risk, increasing level of market intelligence, and driving improved product development. But it takes hard work to unlock the theoretical benefits of trade. So we are actually in the process of doing that in several important ways. The first is that we're working very hard on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, which is an agreement with a number of countries in Asia, including Japan, as well as the United States. Together, these countries represent 40% of world GDP. So when this agreement is completed, it will open some of the world's fastest growing markets to US goods and services. The second thing we're doing is expanding our trade relationship with Europe through the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP. And the US and the EU combined are responsible for nearly half of global GDP, about 1/3 of all international trade, and have a combined market of over 800 million people. So $2.7 billion in goods and services flow each day between the US and the EU, and we have invested $4 trillion in each other's economy. TTIP is going to eliminate tariffs, reduce non-tariff barriers to trade with the European Union, and also better align our regulatory and standards regimes so that we will reduce many bureaucratic handles in exporting to the EU. We're also negotiating a number of sectoral market opening agreements under the World Trade Organization that, when completed, should give new opportunities to some of the United States' most competitive industries. And a couple of these include a trade and services agreement, as well as duty-free treatment for information technology products. Many of these agreements have intellectual property rights provisions, which require that other countries protect the innovations that American companies bring to the table. The United States has long argued that strong intellectual property rights provide critical legal and financial incentives for innovation. But as important as trade policy is, it cannot alone be sufficient as a standalone for international competitive strategy. In the past 20 years, the internet has become a platform for economic growth and innovation as fundamental as highways, power grids, and universities. By 2016, the internet economy will reach $4.2 trillion in the G20 economies alone. As you know, millions of companies now rely on the internet for managing their supply chain and human resources, for selling their products, and for streamlining their back office operations, even as they expand internationally. What is even more dramatic is the growth in developing markets, where the internet economy is growing at 15 to 25% per year. There are tangible benefits to this growth in the developing world, and one example is farmers in Kenya are using mobile devices and services like DrumNet to compare prices for their produce at a range of locations, and are now earning 33 to 40% more for their crops. You would think that these kind of statistics would be enough to emphasize the positive impact on economic growth for all countries. But we still have work to do, and we are advocating around the world that all stakeholders, governments, civil society, business, and others have a shared responsibility to adopt policies and practices that ensure the internet's continued growth. We're emphasizing 3 critical messages around the world. First, all stakeholders have a shared responsibility to promote access to broadband, particularly in developing countries. Second, that we have to strengthen the free flow of information and avoid censorship or balkanization of the internet. And third, that we all have a shared responsibility to address misuse of the internet. But we need to do that in a way that preserves the openness of the internet. A third issue that underpins our competitiveness is the State Department's role in promoting international science and technology cooperation and innovation. I think this is something that is not very well known, but it's very, very important. The United States has benefited tremendously from scientific, technological, and the industrial innovation. Innovation is responsible for nearly 3/4 of the United States post-World War II economic growth. Knowledge-based U.S. companies exported more than $1 trillion, approximately 74% of total U.S. exports in 2011 alone. The State Department and the U.S. government support a large number of programs that build international collaboration on science, both for their scientific benefit and because they bolster diplomatic ties and cultural exchange. There's an important competitiveness component to this work. Intensified scientific dialogues and exchanges help advance U.S. values such as merit review, critical thinking, diversity of thought, and transparency, and support collaboration between U.S. scientists, researchers, and entrepreneurs and their foreign counterparts. And this in turn improves the knowledge and capacity of our own scientists and companies. We also hold structured policy dialogues, exchanges, and other programs with foreign governments to help them identify policies that support innovation. These policies fall across a wide spectrum that include good governance, an open internet, science-based regulatory regimes, legal frameworks that provide predictable intellectual property rights regimes, and minimize corruption. Equally important, we counsel our partners to avoid policies that harm innovation and are inherently unsustainable. As an example of our science and technology cooperation with the EU, we have ended up establishing interoperable research centers in both the US and the EU that collaborate on electric vehicle research and on standards. Our work promoting science and technology and innovation makes American companies more competitive because they have greater access to the people, institutions, and companies doing cutting-edge research around the world. Our companies and scientists can enter into partnerships and exchange information that can lead to new innovation and new market opportunities. In conclusion, the State Department and the U.S. government are actively engaged in shaping the economic and technological forces sweeping the world to support the competitiveness of the United States. And we feel that if we can set the right policy environment and make the right connections and help people to do that, we are confident that our people, our universities, and our companies can do the rest. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Randy Woodson. I'm the Chancellor at North Carolina State University in Raleigh. You know, I'm here to talk about talent, and I feel like I've heard about talent all day because it's been a part of the conversation from almost every panelist. Let me give you a little context. NC State is a large public research university, one of the land-grant universities founded that Adena talked about by Abraham Lincoln and Justin Morrill in the height of the Civil War. And it's a big part of the Research Triangle Park. And one of the themes that I'll try to weave throughout my talk today is the critical role the industry plays as a partner with universities to bring talent forward. And the fact that we benefit tremendously at NC State from being in a region that has a lot of economic activity, a lot of companies, and a lot of engagement with the university. I'll tell you some good stories, and I'll tell you some chinks in the armor and things that I think we all need to be sensitive to. And I'll try to go from K through 12 all the way through post-baccalaureate education. Let's start with the university. Paul and I were talking earlier. He hires a lot of engineers. He told me we're all doing a better job with engineers. Since we produce about 11,000 of them, I'm glad to know that. I think a big reason for that is that we're listening to industry. And we're trying to produce talent these days that's more connected to the workforce, has a better understanding of how to work in teams, how to communicate critically, and how to communicate across disciplinary lines. That hasn't always been the case in disciplines like engineering, but I think it is more so going forward. I'll use a couple of examples. All of us at big technical universities that have large engineering programs have capstone experiences for our students. In their senior year, we try to give them the design and the tools that they need to enter into the workforce. In the past, those were all done as a single discipline. Only civil engineers got together, only industrial engineers, etc. But now, we do that largely by bringing disciplines across the university together so that students understand how to communicate across those lines. I'm going to give you one example some of you may have seen in the news recently, where a capstone experience in material science and engineering at NC State that involved an architectural design student, an industrial design student, a material science and engineer, and a humanities major came up with a new product of a fingernail polish that when this fingernail polish is dipped in a drink that's been tainted with date rape drugs, the fingernail polish changes color. Puts the control back in the hands of a young woman and gives some concern to those that might taint a drink with chemicals. And that's because a team of people that got together, including polymer chemists and a humanist that's interested in sexual assault, brought this problem forward, and that's what a team was able to do. They've launched a company called Undercover Colors. In fact, they have investors now. So that's an example of, I think, the way that we need to rethink the way we prepare talent for the workforce. We give them an opportunity to use their science and their knowledge, but also to think creatively about how to take that to the marketplace, and personally, how they can go through the process of taking it to market. I want to give you another example that's a relationship with a large software company in the Triangle. SAS Institute, one of the largest privately held software companies in the world, came out of NC State. A professor and his PhD student, Jim Goodnight and John Saul, started the company in the late 70s. This company hires a lot of students from around the country. And one day, Jim Goodnight called the Chancellor, my predecessor, and said, you know, you guys aren't producing talent that we need. We need analysts, data analysts that understand how to do statistics and applied math, but also how to work across the disciplines and bring in business skills. And he said, you need to create a new master's program. And you know, universities aren't particularly good at this because the faculty have to do this. But he put enough money on the table to inspire us to greatness. And today, we have a master's in advanced analytics that's producing 80 graduates every year. The average graduate last year had 9 job offers. These are students that come from applied math, statistics, everything from business, but they come together for a year-long intensive master's program, and they're getting tremendous leverage in the industry because we're producing a product, yes, students can be products, that the industry needs. And we've got to be more nimble like that in higher education. We've got to be willing to respond to the private sector, think differently about the way we deliver education programs, and bring those to market. I think we do that well at the graduate level. I'm not so sure we do it at the undergraduate level. And that's what industry is telling us now, that we need to produce baccalaureate degrees that think differently about the roles that they play in the private sector. We've even had some very key leaders across the country stand up and say, we don't need liberal arts. I'm going to tell you, I disagree with that. And this is coming from an engineer at a place where we produce a lot of engineers. We desperately need the critical thinking skills that the liberal arts brings to disciplines across all of our campuses. And that's the beauty of American higher education, that we don't segment education in technical schools that aren't fully comprehensive and don't bring all the skills to the table. I want to talk a little bit about K through 12 and an experiment that we have in Raleigh with the Wake County school system, the K through 12 school system. This is the concept of early college career high schools. We've talked a lot today, you've heard a number of speakers talk about the German model of identifying talent early, putting them through a pipeline of going through technical schools as compared to a 4-year baccalaureate degree program. I, like many others today, would tell you that's not something that I would be particularly supportive of, since if my career were defined by the way I behaved in the 8th grade, I wouldn't be here before you today, because I redefined myself several times throughout my career. So I hope that our system of higher education and K through 12 continues to evolve and allow students to change over the course of their educational journey. Having said that, we've launched an early college career high school in STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and math, bringing in students from diverse backgrounds where they study on our campus. They go to high school for 5 years. In the last 2 years of their high school experience, free of charge to the student, they're fully enrolled at NC State. And by the time they finish the 5 years of high school, again, at no cost to the student, they have at least 60 to 75 hours at NC State toward a science and technology degree. It's an emerging trend across the country. It's a very affordable education and a way to diversify fields that frankly don't have a lot of diversity in areas like engineering and math. So it's a way to expand STEM. So we have a lot of work to do. We have challenges in terms of being nimble and responsive to the industry that hires our graduates. But I think the most critical thing that we all face is having conversations like the Council inspires every year. And that's bringing together thought leaders from industry, thought leaders from the national labs, thought leaders from labor and higher education to really focus on the critical issues of competitiveness. And I think it's changing higher education. I know it's changing at NC State. One of the things that I would leave you with, though, is this is not all parts of the country are equally blessed in terms of having companies and industries that interact with the universities the way we experience in the Triangle and the way other regions of the country do. So we have to think critically about how do we move all of education forward in an environment where a lot of young people aren't exposed to Cisco, IBM, GlaxoSmithKline, and the many companies that we have in the Triangle. And so we really need to think about the democratization of education and giving those young people a clear view of what's ahead of them in the future. So I'm looking forward to the conversation, and thank you for having me here today.
It's always interesting when you get to go last, and especially have a subject as broad as infrastructure, and especially when the three people that go before you set you up pretty well. We heard about Lincoln and federal investment. We heard about a level playing field. What can be more in a level playing field than being able to efficiently move goods and services to ports, to get raw materials to production centers? And we heard about talent. And when I talked about talent, the one thing I'm seeing is exactly what you talked about. In the public sector, in the public works business that I'm in, you have to always understand that you're designing something for people. And I think engineers sometimes get lost in the A-frame, cable-stayed, record span, cantilevered lane business, which we all think is really great, but we have to understand we design for people, and the public investment is for people. It's about quality of life, it's about global competitiveness, and now even more than maybe when Eisenhower thought about the National Defense Highway System, it's about security. It's about resilience, and that's the case for public investment. That just came very clear to me when I heard everybody else speak of how infrastructure really becomes a cornerstone, a pillar for competitiveness. I've been asked to talk about funding, where we stand with funding. not maybe the most enjoyable topic, but I'm gonna let you know where we start. I'm gonna concentrate on the Highway Trust Fund. It's been pretty much in the limelight for the last 6 months. Highway Trust Fund insolvency came to a crisis point in August. There was a patch, and we're gonna call it a patch, and anybody that doesn't call it a patch is calling it wrong. It provides gap funding for 10 months, basically at the levels that MAP 21 had for the past 2 years. The industry is appreciative, but nobody in the industry is applauding what was done. I had opportunity to speak to 3 House members. Since it was passed, they all apologized for what they did. But again, it keeps us going for another 10 months. I'm going to talk about what's the same with what's happened in August on the Highway Trust Fund and what's different. But first, some context. I just recently, and I may be late in doing this, looked at the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, which ranked the U.S. 16th in the world in overall quality of infrastructure. To get more specific in what I'm talking about now, it was 16th in roads, 15th in railroads, 12th in ports, and surprising to me, 24th in the quality of electricity supplied. I was really shocked at that number. So let's talk about where we are with infrastructure. What we have right now in place for infrastructure funding is essentially what was in place at the end of 2013. Funding runs out in 9 months. Sustainable revenue to the Highway Trust Fund has not been decided. The patch is funded not through user fees, not through any kind of new revenue. It's funded by 10 years, 10 months of funding now is funded by 10 years of pension smoothing, custom fees, and a transfer from the leaking underground storage tank fund. So that's how we're funding this 10-year, $10 billion gap. There's not enough money to get through the next fiscal year, the upcoming fiscal year. Here's what happens. Uncertainty causes long-term planning to be deferred. Major public works projects require a lot of planning, take a long time. Environmental reports take a long time. They start to get deferred. My company is seeing this now. Requests for proposals are being delayed. Other parts of work are being delayed because there's uncertainty in what the funding is going to be next year. The other thing that happens is the uncertainty makes our industry less attractive to new students coming out. We've had a lot of good momentum. There's been great things that happened in the bridge industry, for instance. We have a bridge engineer who won the MacArthur Award. I don't think that's ever happened before. It was really highlight for the industry. He was on Esquire's 16 Geniuses That Give Us Hope, featured on NBC Nightly News. And he actually became kind of a superstar in our own little world, which attracted a lot of people to the industry and a lot of people to my company, which is good. We need that momentum to continue. The momentum will continue when people know there's jobs out there for them to go to. The other thing that's really critical is that infrastructure is very capital intensive. I just came back from a meeting that was attended by contractors, material suppliers, equipment manufacturers. And they're all talking about a sense that there'll be a holdback in ordering new equipment. There'll be a somewhat of a holdback in how we're developing material supplies until there's a certainty of where this is going to be done. Those are the issues that happen without having sustainable long-term funding. The issue of funding isn't difficult. Transportation should and always has been paid for by the users. I think you'll find most people in this industry think that it's something that it should be paid for by people who use the facilities, just like almost everything else. The Highway Trust Fund and the gas tax was the way that was accomplished. We all know that we haven't had a gas tax increase since 1993, 21 years at 18 cents. Just the inflation has caused the problem we're seeing right now. Transportation never was partisan. Now it's very partisan. It's interesting that you mentioned Lincoln, because the other people who were big in transportation funding, Eisenhower, who started the National Defense Highway System, started the gas tax. Reagan and Clinton both increased the user fee, and all three of them seem to have a pretty good economy. So it doesn't seem to be that's going to kill the economy if we raise the user fee. So let's talk about what's different. What's different, I think, is really significant. The crisis in the Highway Trust Fund and the prospect of depending on who you want to believe, somewhere between 300,000 and 700,000 layoffs, which would have occurred over the course of the 6 months after the Highway Trust Fund became insolvent. There's just not enough time to get private sector investment and other investment available, has caused the conversation to come to the limelight. It's, there's articles, news articles appearing in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today. It's on TV. It's come to the forefront. That's going to be very good in helping solve the problem. There was a bipartisan move to increase the gas tax. This is almost unheard of. The Cochran-Murphy bill that never really got to be a bill, but at least was talked about in the Senate, was a really big move for someone to come out and actually say, maybe we need to do this. Congress members of both sides, of both parties, in both House and the Senate, now want to get this behind them. It's been really negative publicity for Congress to sit there and hear about they're not investing in infrastructure in the United States. That may spur getting something done to find a way that we're going to fund public infrastructure in the United States. What do we need to look at going forward? Congress agenda is full. Certainly international issues are increasing in intensity. The debt ceiling's coming up in March again, right? That'll be interesting. Budget in April. This issue ought to be easy. We want a user-funded solution, whether that be tolls, whether that be public-private partnerships, whether that be increasing the gas tax, vehicle miles traveled. It may be a combination of all three. We ought to be able to get this done. It's not now an issue, I don't think, for Transportation and Infrastructure Committee or for the EPW Committee in the Senate. Now it's an issue for Finance Committee and for Ways and Means, who find a way that we pay for things. So I would say that while our funding position right now is the same as it was at the end of 2013, the good news is that it's on top of mind. It's in the public debate, and I can be very hopeful that we'll see some kind of a positive outcome. But I do think that as we heard from everybody, the thing that we're trying to convince everybody in Congress now, because we think we've convinced the public, is the return on investment that the United States gets from funding public works. And I mean, that's easily calculable, and it's significant. Thank you.
Well, I'm supposed to be the provocateur, and I think we have about 15 minutes. So I'll just provoke for a second or two and then turn this over to all of you to have a discussion with our fantastic panelists. And, you know, I'm thinking about 2004 to 2014, you know, the period from the National Innovation Initiative. And I guess if we go back to Charles Dickens, we could say during that time it was the best of times and the worst of times. But fortunately, as we look ahead, you know, I think we all feel, while there are many challenges, you know, we are beginning to turn into the brighter side. But, you know, when you think back in 2004, we had really strong economic growth. We were still in this tremendous period of productivity. We were the first country in the world in foreign direct investment. We had a lot of bipartisan consensus. While we weren't making progress on multilateral trade, we were doing a lot of bilateral trade. We still saw great investment, although we wanted more in research and development. And we continued to see an understanding that the economy really depended on innovation. And then, of course, 2008, the Great Recession, the drop, tremendous crisis, employment, jobs, and really digging out of that today. And what we talked about in the clarion call, and I don't want to repeat here, but is unless we grow our economy, we're going to continue to see low productivity and this challenge around jobs for the future. So the other thing, of course, that was going on during the NII period, and I want to kind of get into this, is at that time we thought we were a country that was energy weak. We were all concerned about energy security. And you know what? Virtually no one was talking about manufacturing. Keenan, remember that. We had to work hard at the council to even get manufacturing as a subject in the National Innovation Initiative, because everyone said, well, we don't need to make things anymore. We're going to do the design, we're going to do the innovation, and everything's going to be made elsewhere. But we know, of course, that that was not a strategy for the future. So today we're poised to be energy strong. We're seeing a resurgence in manufacturing, and we still have the best universities, the best lab, and tremendous talented people. So let's go into this discussion. I want to start with Adena, and congratulations on becoming the president of NASDAQ OMX. I had the pleasure to work with Adena, and she's one of truly the rising women leaders in the world. So I want to publicly congratulate you for your new role. But you talked a lot about the whole financing continuum and how important both the debt and the public sector and private sector markets are. One of the things we're hearing, lots of anecdotal stories, is that our very innovative companies, our startups, are not able to scale because of financing. They reach a certain point, the valley of death, and they don't go any further. And we just heard, we're going to talk about this tomorrow at the American Energy Manufacturing Summit, 4 major energy innovations funded by the U.S. government at our national laboratories, beginning to scale up, couldn't get the financing for their build out, and all of those assets were bought up and are now in China. So what is really going on, Adena, in this whole valley of death and how it relates to the innovation, job creation of the future?
I think that's a great question, because if we look at the continuum, I kind of painted a very rosy story of going from being very small with venture money, going into potentially private equity money, and then going public or going straight to the public markets, and obviously having debt financing easily available to you. Small to medium companies are still struggling on the debt financing side, for sure. If you're an established player, you've got investment grade, or you can show that your credit is worthy, you have very easy access to debt. Those small to medium-sized companies continue to struggle with that. And then when we look at the venture-backed companies, they have a limit on how much capital they can put into an individual investment or into investments in general. I talked about how much money was really being raised, and if you compare it to what the public markets provide, it's still considerably smaller. So there's this kind of moment in time when a venture-backed company may still not be profitable, but they still are on a path to success, and yet they haven't been able to convince the public markets that they can be profitable, and they haven't been able to convince debt investors that they're a good credit. And they're too big for another venture check. So it's a very, I would say, a dangerous time for a company. A part of that is making sure you can, in fact, tell your story. Part of that is making sure you've got good advocates and long-term investors in your company early. So make sure that when you're choosing your venture capital investors, that they really are in it to take you and bridge you all the way, and not just in it for an easy 2-year equity check. And make sure that also you talk to them early about the path to the next step, so that they're positioning you to be successful going forward. In terms of energy investing, it's a great issue for this country to grapple with, because I think alternative energy is always the great hope. And yet we find that we stall out on a lot of this investment. It's kind of like biotech. But the biotech difference between alternative energy investment and biotech is that biotech's a binary outcome, right? You either get approved and make a ton of money, and there continues to be IP protection against that and a real opportunity, or you don't get approved and you lose all your money. And the public markets have kind of accepted that as just part of what you do when you invest in biotech companies. We've had, I think, 40 biotech companies come to market this year. But in energy, it's not so binary, and it's hard to know. So it would be nice if the public investment would help bridge the private investment, get them in earlier, get them in to make sure that they kind of give them a bridge to make sure that they can ultimately succeed. And I think there's got to be more of a partnership there over the long term.
Question on financing, on technology commercialization. Yes. Dan.
Well, a couple of points. The kudos to the Obama administration on trying to do something to reconcile the commodities control list and ITAR. The United States used to be the world's leader in machine tools. We're about 4 to 5% now because of just horrible export control laws, and we lost most of our manufacturing in satellites because of the same thing. And so I would encourage you to continue to work with the members of Congress to try to understand that bill. The second thing is on the gas tax. The vehicle miles traveled will destroy small towns. There are a lot of people that live in little towns that must, out of necessity, travel 40 and 50 miles each way. And to put a computer on their car and send them a bill at the end of the year would be absolutely disastrous. And I agree with you. We have to have other ways to do that, but I would just urge you to take that option out of your vocabulary, because that will destroy small town America. And most small towns in the Midwest are already destroyed. They don't need that.
Undersecretary Novelli, you are really in the front line now of dealing with this whole new set of global infrastructure issues around cybersecurity and how that relates to intellectual property and many other things as well. How do you see the role of the State Department and the role of cyber-enabled infrastructure in some of the emerging trade agreements? I know we're having some discussion with the EU on this, but is there something that the State Department and the U.S. should be doing to really ensure that we're going to have more resilient, secure IT infrastructure for what we've been talking about all day?
Right, and I think that's a well-recognized issue. The solution to it is not obvious, however, and that is because we have a robust private sector that is manning a lot of our critical infrastructure. And so we don't want to, as a government, completely dictate what they're doing on this. At the same time, we want to make sure that those critical infrastructure aren't going to be vulnerable to cyber attack. And it also relates to who buys which pieces of our critical infrastructure and where. And so we have a whole, it's called CFIUS process, to review that. And it's not because we don't want inward investment, we absolutely do, but we have to really be careful to safeguard our own infrastructure. At the same time, other countries are using cybersecurity as an excuse for keeping our products out, for having rules about data and who can do what where, and really isn't related to that at all. And so I think part of what we are trying to do is strip away those excuses and get at the heart of the matter, and at the same time work with our own industry on these cyber issues, as well as the whole multi-stakeholder system, so that we can march forward with our allies and countries who are similarly thinking.
Another bill.
Madam Undersecretary, can you give us a little primer on the current controversy on internet governance and possible loss of U.S. government control and opening that up to a supposed parade of horribles with internet shut down in various other countries?
Well, there's two aspects to this. One is the United States, when we created the internet, there is this institution called ICANN that does all the names, the .net, the .edu, and these have now been expanded, as you know. And the United States has had, it's a sort of a quasi-private, quasi-public institution, Department of Commerce has had oversight over. We've announced that we are going to, as the government, step back and let that be governed in a private way, which has made a lot of developing countries happy because they felt like they were not as integrally involved in this and their concerns weren't as taken into account. Although I would suggest that part of that problem is that they didn't also try to participate. And so there's been a lot of concern that's raised about, well, how is that actually going to work? And what happens if things run amok? And what are the safeguards? And what I can say is that we're trying to figure that out in consultation with all these other stakeholders, the business community, other governments, the NGO community, with engineers, et cetera, to figure out what are the safeguards behind this so that the naming and the ease and quickness of making decisions can continue. So that is something that's a work in progress. We have been very clear that we're not going to move ourselves out of ICANN until we have a satisfactory solution. The other issue that I think is less well known is that telecommunications, for a long time, all the technical aspects of its standards and spectrum and who has what in which spectrum has been governed by an international treaty that is under the auspices of the UN called the International Telecommunications Union. And that's worked very, very well. It's a binding treaty. It's made interconnection of telecommunications work. However, there are many who are now suggesting that that group should take over control of all the standards, all the protocols, issues of censorship, issues of access to markets for the entire internet. And needless to say, that is not something the United States agrees with. And unfortunately, there are a number of developing countries, some very large, who think this would be just a great idea. And so we are working very hard to, not just as a government to educate, but to work with our private sector, to reach out through their own networks and get those who are benefiting from the open internet today to tell their own governments that this would be a complete disaster for their economy. But there is a very large gap between government policymakers in some countries and what's going on in their economy actually. And so it's really a challenge that we have undertaken to try to help bridge that gap, but it's not something that we can do alone.
Keenan.
I have two questions, Adena. One, with the private equity swelling rather rapidly, do you see the model changing and private equity moving towards early stage? That's one question. Taking the place of or augmenting VC capital. The other is, how do you see the family offices playing a role in stimulating innovation and making direct investments?
Sure. So I think that actually if we look at, I'm going to cover one more point, which is private equity and infrastructure, because I think that that's another area where you're going to see some changes. But the big changes in private equity actually are the fact that a lot of the very largest investors who put money into private equity, they want their money to continuously be put to work instead of getting it back and then having to figure out how to redeploy it. So there's definitely going to be more of an emphasis on I don't want to say permanent vehicles, but longer term vehicles where they can see their money continue to grow and roll over. That actually plays quite well to the potential for infrastructure investment if there's a return, right? And that's the key challenge that's always been established with infrastructure investment, is actually getting the return. The other spectrum of it is this concept of early stage. And I definitely see some of the larger firms certainly coming down and creating what I'll call growth-oriented funds. Carlyle has a few growth-oriented funds that step down from big buyout and kind of create that bridge between venture and buyout, where they might make minority investments or they might make smaller investments into growth-oriented companies, technology-oriented companies that kind of bridge them up to the big leagues. But the fact is, though, that I think that again, there has to be a return, right? So if the return is unclear, whether it's in energy technology or any other technology, if the return is unclear, it's very hard for them to underwrite those deals. So I do think that that's going to be, that valley of death is a hard thing, because those companies are probably in a situation where they can't articulate their return. But there might be more patient investors, right? So if they're looking at longer term vehicles, they may be more patient going forward and be willing to take those risks for a longer period of time. In terms of family offices, but not just family offices, I actually say the LP space in general, just limited partners and pension funds, both public and private pensions, as well as family offices, they are looking more towards direct investment, but usually in conjunction with the fund. So they might invest in the fund and then go in and help fund deals directly as well with those firms that they trust and that they want to partner with. They tend not to have the infrastructure to enable them to make those direct investments themselves, because the private equity firm provides diligence and provides management and provides oversight and board participation. And so they want to partner with the firms to do that. But they certainly means that there's even more money being put to work than really reflected in the fund numbers. And yes, I do think that they can help drive more investment in innovation.
Chancellor Woodson, you know, back in the NII report, we talked a lot about stimulating regional innovation clusters. And, you know, the council actually did that work many, many years ago with Michael Porter about clusters of innovation. Tell us a little bit, we know about research at Triangle Park, but this whole new textile resurgence, and what's the role of the university in making that happen? Because this is a very exciting success story for America.
You know, I wanted to sing the National Science Foundation's praise this afternoon when France was here, because that really started with the University Industry Partnership Grant from the National Science Foundation. It really has led to a resurgence in the textile industry in the state of North Carolina. Now, it's not making yarn into t-shirts and socks. It's really creating the next generation of material that provides protection to our armed forces, provides protection to firemen and firefighters, and actually the filter that's in your coffee pot every morning, or the filters that are in blood that purify blood in transfusions. So it's really a new generation of textiles that's not woven material, but synthesized and created for a specific purpose. We have over 1,000 new companies in the state, most of which are 10 to 25 employees that are producing amazing products. But again, it's not denim for your blue jeans.
Well, when many of you come to the council's new offices that are going to be a cauldron of creativity, we're going to thank Chancellor Woodson for introducing us to a resurgent, creative, innovative Mohawk. And they're very proud that somehow, thanks to Bill Bates and Chad Evans, we chose their edgiest carpets. They could not believe it. But I said they have to be at the Council on Competitiveness. Yeah, but last question, really, and I'll have to take one more from the audience. For you, Paul, you know, we've called in the council for a long time, not only about the need to reauthorize the Exim Bank, strong supporters of that, to compete with, you know, the rest of the world and provide our exports, but for a domestic infrastructure bank. Adena, you talked about the importance of debt financing. We're not going to finance the trillion dollar deficit in infrastructure from equity alone or from venture capital. What can we do to move forward on a national infrastructure bank?
Well, I think a national infrastructure bank is in the works. I think it's something that certainly will help leverage the revenue. Part of the issue is that in order to finance, you have to have revenue. And the revenue is not growing. When you don't grow your revenue, you haven't changed your pricing in 21 years, you're not going to have revenue. to fund the financing, if that's the correct way to say it. But to get an infrastructure bank from the public sector, it really is about a grassroots effort with Congress. We really have to change people's minds in Congress on infrastructure. If you go out and look at surveys of the general public, it'll all be very positive. When it gets to Congress, it all dies. And I think the real key here is that in order to make it work, it needs to be paid by the users. This should be deficit neutral. Everything that we do in infrastructure should be certainly surface transportation infrastructure, and I would guess a number of other of the various utilities that come into infrastructure should be deficit neutral. There's no reason why it can't be paid for by the users. But in order to get an infrastructure bank, I think it's as simple as getting Congress to understand. I mean, in certain ways, the Tiger grants and other, Garvey bonds before and other things started down that path. But I think that's really what we need to do.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank our fantastic panel for all their contributions. And I can't help but say that the American Competes legislation that was so much based on the work of the Council and our other partners in Washington, sadly to say, was the last piece of bipartisan legislation signed by President Bush and endorsed and reauthorized by President Obama. So I think our marching orders are clear. In the years ahead, we got to bring back that bipartisan consensus and action for these challenges. So thank you so much.